And thing 3 you need to know about China to understand it in the modern context is China totally sucked for about 200 years solid. And I'm roughing in the dates here, but about 1750 to about 1950, give or take a few years on either side. It's actually referred to as China's period of humiliation at this point in history. And that truly is what it was. And I do want you to consider the timeline. The last 200 years. How old is the United States of America? About 200 years. So for virtually the entire existence of the most powerful country on planet Earth, the United States of America, China has been not just sidelined, not just on the periphery, but actually actively not in good shape. Meaning that it wasn't that no one knew about China, that, oh, we suddenly forgot that big-ass country over there in East Asia. It simply was, oh gosh, China, whew, that country is so backwards, it's so far behind, there's no hope for it, it's so underdeveloped, it's so low development, it plays no part in world politics, it has no power, even economically, it stinks. Yeah, for 200 years. So that's why most Americans look at China now. I always laugh at these people on television who act like they know stuff, but they're just reading off a script, and even the people who write the script don't know stuff. And they're saying things like, China's coming into its own. Oh, China's becoming a fully developed country. Oh, China might be a world power someday. And it's like, no, China's back, all right? China's used to being in the center of things, as I suggested from thing 2. And it went through this really bad period that is the entirety of modern history, the last 200 years. So everybody's dismissed it for so long. We're just now getting back to the idea of, oh, this is just yet another cycle that China has gone through for several thousand years. As I've suggested, dynasties come and go. Emperors come and go. Sometimes there's good ones, sometimes they're bad ones. Sometimes the imperial line lasts 10 years, sometimes it lasts 400. But eventually they crash and burn. And in one of these low ebb periods when the Chinese crashed and burned, it just coincided with modern history. And it's just been in a down period for a couple hundred years. So let's talk about it in a bit more detail. And I'm now going to wildly, horrifically, terribly simplify the last couple hundred years of Chinese history. But again, to do a whole course on Chinese history over 4 months wouldn't be enough to cover the complexities, the nuances, and all the details of Chinese history. So we have to abbreviate, as it were. So I'm just going to give you the highlights of why it was in this period of horrible decline for the last couple hundred years. Well, as I suggested, dynasties come and go. And up until the 1700s, the Manchus, the dynasty that pushed China to its greatest territorial extent, was doing pretty good. They absorbed Mongolia and Tibet, and they were the masters of the world economy. Even after the Americas had been discovered, China was still the epicenter of the place that everybody's trying to get to buy silks and spices and porcelains and this and that and the other. And the Chinese trade was also one-sided. Global interaction was all one way. So China would take your money and sell you stuff, but that's as far as they wanted to go. So even the world's deposits of gold and silver, China kind of demanded, yes, you're going to pay us in cash. Most trade is truly that, trade. We'll give you so many cars, you give us so many computers, you do this, you'll give us that. We'll do 100 tons, million tons of wheat, and you'll buy cars from us, something to that effect. China got to a point for most of its modern history, and it was just saying, no, you pay in cash. We've got the stuff you want. We're not interested in your stuff. We don't need your stuff. So even the world's reserves of gold and silver for centuries were moving into China. China was the richest state. There was no close second. China was rich. But this global interaction that's all one way starts to catch up with it. It makes them the masters of the world there for a good long time, but it starts to unravel because keep in mind the historical context. What's going on around the rest of the planet in the 1600s as the Manchus achieve their greatest territorial extent and dominate East Asia. What's happening elsewhere in the 1600s into the 1700s? That's the exact time period that Columbus and Da Gama and all these explorers that had gone out in 1500, they started to get their act together. European exploration and colonization kicks off because the Europeans adopt a lot of world technologies, including a bunch from China, and make them better and use them for different reasons. They adopt Chinese gunpowder and make guns instead of fireworks. They take over the navigational prowess of the Arabs and all of the folks that plied the East Asian trade. And by that I mean the Indian Ocean trade. So the Indian Ocean was the focus for most world trade because all the people who wanted stuff in Africa and Europe would get it from what's now India or Southeast Asia or around to China. So the Indian Ocean was the active place, and Arab traders for a very long time ruled the roost on that, which is why the Middle East got rich. But the Europeans are going to take over from the Middle Easterners and start to dominate world trade by use of force with guns, with the navigational aids that they picked up from the Arab traders, and with a real will to dominate the rest of the world for trade. And there's lots of reasons why that happened, and we'll get to that in the European lecture. But the point is, think about the time frame. At the very apex of Manchu power is when the Europeans get their act together and start to pull ahead. And the Europeans are very adept at absorbing technologies, making them better, using them for different purposes, building navies, building militaries. Building militaries they put on their navies. Extending their power outward to the rest of the world, something that China actually never really did too much. China's always been what we call a land power. They've dominated the land, they've dominated their borders, and pushed into the land from their current existing borders. They've never sent out a big fleet, a naval fleet, to take over another part of planet Earth. The Europeans, on the other hand, did. So the age of European exploration and colonization finally reaches China in the 1800s. Remember, the Europeans had already taken over North America, South America, Australia. They made inroads into India. They'd taken over Africa by 1884. They took over all of Africa, the whole continent. So the Europeans are slowly branching out, and by the 1800s, they are knocking on China's door. They're knocking on Japan's door, saying, hey, we're here. We're more powerful than you. Our technologies are actually better than you. And so we want to get into your market and dominate it. But we want to trade with you openly. It's at this juncture that the Manchus, again, everything's cyclical when it comes to political power in China and the world. So it's a cyclical thing that the Manchus were starting to slack. All right? They reached their apex in the 1600s, but by 1800s, they're weak. They're weak as in domestic power. There's starting to be pieces of their empire which don't want to pay as much taxes, which don't want to follow the rules, which maybe want to break off and become an independent state. The Manchus are becoming increasingly ineffective at running the bureaucracy, which of course accelerates other entities wanting to either take power or pull parts of China away and become independent, say like Tibet. And technologically, they're getting behind. So I've now explained ad nauseum that the Chinese, for most of their history, have been very one-sided, semi-isolationist when it comes to absorbing ideas or technologies or trade with other parts of planet Earth. And they have been. And that's been okay for most of the last couple thousand years because things didn't move that fast. So even if there was some great, say, military technology that the Chinese heard about, they would have time to figure it out. Maybe if it was introduced to them, they could say, we're not going to buy that now, but we'll figure out how to duplicate it. We'll make it ourselves. So they could still play the semi-isolationist game and still control things, at least in their neighborhood and their greater neighborhood around East Asia. But things start to get accelerated when the Europeans get into this game. They have an agricultural revolution, an industrial revolution. They start making lots of guns and, again, exuding power, pushing power outside of Europe. And the technologies are being developed so rapidly that the Chinese are not absorbing them quick enough. And they're getting behind, badly behind at an exact time that you can't afford to get badly behind. So they're remaining semi-isolationists. They're saying, no, we're not going to let Chinese society change. We're going to try to keep a hold on our society and what we got. We're not going to embrace foreign technologies. We're not going to allow guns in here. We see what the Europeans are doing, but we're not sure we want to go that route yet. And that's going to be one of the things that gets them in the end. Because by the mid-1800s, and again, we're thinking 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, the Europeans have not only come in there and said, hey, we want to trade with you. They're saying, hey, we're coming in on battleships with guns pointing at you, and we're going to trade with you. And you're going to buy our goods and services, and we are going to set up shop here in China, producing some of these goods for our own trade networks. All of history up to this point, China, and I'm talking about the state of China, the government of China, they controlled trade. So down in Guangdong state, Guangdong province, these really super rich trade cities that I've been talking about, places like Guangzhou, Hong Kong, Shanghai. These are places, Shanghai's not in Guangdong, by the way, but down south where the major trade ports were, the Chinese government actually controlled them, and they would tell, merchants, here's what you're going to do. Here are the rules. You won't accept foreign currency. You'll only accept gold and silver. You'll only trade so much. You'll trade these items and not that items. You have a license to do tea and nothing else. You have a license to do silk. You won't import any. The government still controls it. And so when the Europeans showed up and said, hey, we want to open up a trade shop, a merchant shop here in Guangdong, in Guangzhou, the Chinese government would say, no, no. You park your ship offshore and you send a representative in, and then you'll deal with our people. The Europeans, and by the way, the Chinese government controlled it to their advantage. Surprise, surprise. Again, all governments do that. So the Europeans wanted to break this monopolistic hold, the Chinese government's hold on trade, by physically opening up their own trade ports and their own shops. And by the mid-1850s, they had succeeded at doing this by force. Now, again, I'm not going to go into all of the details of every single battle all over the place, but you did have specific ones I'll point out, like the Opium Wars. And this is in the 1840s. And there's more than one Opium War, but the most famous one I'm just going to reference is 1842. And in 1842, the British, again, a European power, keen on breaking into the Chinese trade, said, hey, we're following the rules. We're doing this stuff. We'd like to get more in there. We'd like for you to buy good British-made goods. And the Chinese were like, why do we need that crap for? We can make anything that you make, and we can make it better. So just bring gold and silver. And the Brits were running out of money. And they're like, well, we still need all this tea and the porcelain and silk. So how can we force that? What can we sell to China to make them buy our stuff? And the answer they came across was, as the war defines it, opium. It sounds crazy, right? The British said, we're going to sell opium in China. And they did a gangbuster's job of it. It's called being a drug dealer. Check it out. So they got a lot of Chinese folks hooked up on opium. And of course, when you're an addict, you'll pay whatever you want. You just want the stuff. And opium has been known for a long time. The British didn't invent it. But they are the ones that penetrated the Chinese market. Again, when the Manchus are weakening in power domestically and abroad. The Manchu dynasty is getting weaker and weaker and weaker and more ineffectual and corrupt. So you can start to pay off local officials to do what you want. The Chinese government can't control them. And the Brits start selling opium, heroin, to the Chinese masses. The Chinese government steps in and says, dude, you can't do this. You can't sell drugs in our country. And the British said, yes, we must. We must. It is our God-given right to sell opium. And again, I'm not exaggerating. They were basing this on a very famous work from 1776. No, not the Declaration of Independence, but bonus points for remembering that. In 1776, this book came out by a British guy. It was called The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, ardent capitalist. And in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith basically, and I'm paraphrasing here, says, open and free trade is the way to success all over planet Earth, and it's certainly the way to success for the countries that control it. And so we should fight for open and free trade all the time. And you know what? It's like capitalism, it's the natural state of things. In other words, it's a God-derived natural state of things. In other words, it's a God-given right that we should have free trade. So the Brits actually went to war with the Chinese on the principle of free trade so that they could sell heroin to Chinese people. Could you make it up? I mean, I'm simplifying it, but that's it. And so the Chinese government said, please don't sell drugs in our country. And if you do, we're going to attack your ships. We will not allow you to sell heroin down in Guangzhou. And the Brits said, if you stop us, we will declare war on you. And finally, a stronger government representative said, this is ridiculous. I'm going to actually enforce the law. And he seized a bunch of British ships full of heroin and burnt them. Seized them, took the property and burnt them. And then the British said, well, we told you we were going to declare war, so we declare war. And because the Chinese were behind, because the Manchus were ineffective, weak, corrupt, technologically inept, and behind, the superior British forces came in and just had a shooting match and said, okay, we're going to kill a bunch of you. And now that we've won this opium war, and again, there are several of them in the 1840s, and the British won them all handily, easily. then they set the terms and said, okay, we're going to be, Chinese government, you owe us for all the heroin you seized and burned. You owe us for the ships. And we are going to renegotiate the trade agreements. Basically, we, the Brits, are going to write it, and you're going to sign it, or we're going to beat the hell out of you some more. And the Chinese government, the Manchu government, was forced. It was forced, and it's, all right. As soon as that happened, it opened the floodgates. Because every other European power said, well, the Brits did it. Well, we have the same technology they do, so we're going to go get in there too. We're going to go in and set up shop and renegotiate the trade agreements based on what we, the Europeans, want, not what the Chinese government wants. That's why it's so crucially important, by the way. It's a big deal. Not only did it resort out the global trade scenario that then now favored the Europeans over the Chinese, but little things like this port called Hong Kong was ceded to the British, which is why Hong Kong has a very British feel about it. It only reverted recently. We'll get to that later. In 1843, Hong Kong was lost to the British, and Macau, another sister city down in Guangdong, was lost to the Portuguese. So 2 major trade ports were lost to foreign powers, and this is the first time ever that a European power controlled anything in China. And Guangzhou basically had to open its door to foreign trade, period. So even though Guangzhou wasn't taken over, the trade was basically reversed. Does that start to make sense? So that's why it's a super big deal. And in very short order, in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, all the major European powers started to get a foothold in China and really take over the Chinese trade, which is, of course, how you make money and how your GDP keeps going and the government maintains power. So not just the Brits, but the Frenchies had zones of control in the south, mostly around this Canton, Guangdong district I'm talking about. The British had Hong Kong. The British took over Shanghai, another major port. The British controlled a lot of the central Chinese coast. The French controlled a lot of the southern Chinese coast. The Portuguese were in there. The Germans even controlled the Shandong Peninsula up north. It's northeast of Beijing for a time. And even Russia started to encroach from the north and kind of, I think they set up a puppet state in what's now Mongolia. And they started to eat off property and control from the north while the Europeans are coming in and eating off control and property from the south. I do want to make this note real quick, though. It's not as if the European powers were coming into China to physically take them over, okay? Much the way that Europeans ended up taking possession of North America, South America, Australia, all of Africa. The Europeans went into those places and said, it's our territory, it's ours, we're taking it. They didn't do that in China. And it's important to note that. They did not do that in China. Why? There was like 500,000 people in China at that point. This is a big state. It's a big population, and it's far away from Europe. The Europeans, I believe, and I'm just, analyzing all the history I've ever read, the Europeans just wanted to control the trade. They were just in it for the money. There was no money to be made in taking over China proper. All they wanted was the trade, and that's all they really took. So they would take control of cities like Shanghai, Hong Kong, Macau, to set it up shop as little enclaves of, yes, we control this territory, this city, but we're mostly setting this up so that we have feet on the ground and power on the ground to control the trade, and that's way more important. They were all about the trade, not about taking over China. Now, how does that manifest itself for understanding Chinese history? They didn't take it over because the Manchus were so corrupt. They were just the Europeans and other outsiders just started to use the Manchu dynasty as a puppet state. So for the last 200 years, from say 1800 onwards, and again, we can go back to 1700 if you like, the Manchus are disintegrating, but they're kept in power by the outsiders who say, no, you guys do the day-to-day. All we're interested in is taking all the money we can from you. So the Manchu dynasty basically way outlived its usefulness and outlived its true existence because it was propped up by outsiders. They're like, no, you guys deal with the internal rebellions and all that crap and collect taxes, and then we'll just get the money from you and control the trade. Okay? That's why the Manchus, that's why I'm saying it's important, because there really wasn't an effective Chinese government for like the last 100 years of it. They did nothing. They were hanging out. And this was starting to infuriate the Chinese people who were seeing their own history and their own culture and their own country start to be sapped away from them by outsiders. And that's not something they've had a historical experience with. So people were agitated, depressed, oppressed, upset, and the government should have been overthrown a lot longer than it was, than it eventually ended up being overthrown later. Should have been sooner. Okay? So, opium wars, loss of territory, loss of control of trade, and it's not just the West, by the way. Let me reference another lecture that I know you've probably already watched already on Japan. And that is what was happening in Japan roughly the same time. You know, same pressures were happening. Europeans were showing up in the 18 teens and 1830s and 1840s and knocking on Japan's door saying, hey, hi, we're from Europe. We're from the government. We're here to help. We're going to open up trade. It's going to be great. You'll love it. And the Japanese, much like the Chinese, said, no, we don't want that. We don't need your crap. We don't want it. Japan was a fully isolationist society at that point, by the way. But this is where China and Japan start to differ. China had a corrupt system in place that was perpetuated long beyond its useful life, intentionally by outsiders, and trade was taken over, and the country just started to disintegrate from the inside out. Japan, and that's because the Chinese said, well, we don't want to adopt foreign ways. We don't want to do that. We're just going to keep railing against these outside foreigners that are controlling trade. Japan, on the other hand, had this Meiji Restoration. And so I'm not going to get in the whole lecture about it, but Japan woke up and said, oh, geez, we see what's happening over in China. Oh, man, they're screwed. Maybe we should not do what China's doing, which is disintegrate and keep a bad government in place. We're going to change our government. We're going to embrace the West. We're going to have a Meiji Restoration to become like the West. Bam. You remember that stuff now? I know you do. So it's this critical juncture in history. China is further disintegrating. Japan steps up, embraces the West, and becomes much more like the West. So much so that Japan becomes one of the other outside foreign powers to start challenging Chinese rule and chipping away at Chinese territory and control of Chinese trade. And this is a huge offense to the Chinese. They had in 1895 the Sino-Japanese War, in which Japan, just after a few decades, stands up and says, wow, we're just as powerful as the Westerners, and the Westerners are taking over China. We want our piece of that pie too. We declare war on you, China. And the Japanese win. They can take over the Korean Peninsula, parts of northeastern China, that's Manchuria, where the Manchus were from. And they also at this time, and do note this, pick up this little island called Taiwan. Yeah, Taiwan, that keeps coming up. So the Japanese challenged China in 1895 and handily win, much the exact same way that a bunch of Europeans had done it for the decades prior to it. So now China is in a situation of, there ain't no government and there ain't no military to speak of. Really, anybody that wants to show up and take anything can. Even the Japanese are doing it. Again, consider how offensive this is. The Europeans, that's one thing. They are these foreign devil dogs from the other side of the continent with superior firepower and superior technology. Okay, they got us. Japan used to be a vassal state of China, for goodness sakes. So did the Koreas. So did Southeast Asia. And all these places are now being taken over by the Europeans and turned against China. And Japan outright has challenged China and won in a battle. So Taiwan, Koreas, some of Manchuria, Taiwan lost to the Japanese the same time that all of the trade is now reverting to European control. It just can't get no worse for China at this point. Can it? Yeah, actually it can. So spheres of influence from Europe and now Japan taking over the Chinese economy effectively, taking over physically some parts of China, but not a whole lot, mostly just the vital trade cities. And it's going to get worse because as Japan starts to develop and become more Western, there's a movement within China to take back their country because honestly, I won't call it chaos yet. It's not to the point of chaos of like, oh, there's murderers running rampant through the streets and the society's burning down every day. No, it's not that. It's just that there's nobody in charge and there's no vision and they keep losing every battle, economic and military, to outsiders, and people are just frustrated going, why are the Manchus still, what is going on here? We're losing ourselves. We're losing our country. So a movement arose called the Boxers. And I don't talk about every single element of Chinese history. I kind of picked the highlights to give you an insight into how the society was thinking at the time. And the Boxer movement, right around 1900, so you're looking at just over a century ago, at the, the kind of low point for China up to this juncture of like, we can't even win against Japan. The Boxer movement was a bunch of, I think, kind of religious folks initially who said, we're losing our country, this is terrible. You know what? We need to become more Chinese. We need to, again, conservative values, resort to the past, traditionalist. Let's pray really hard. Let's, we rally together. Because we're Chinese, because we're awesome, because we're the center of the universe, in our minds, if we pray hard enough and fight hard enough, even bullets won't hurt us. Even though we're only fighting with swords, bullets won't hurt us. And we can repel out the foreign invaders, and let's all do that. Let's have a rebellion. We'll call it the Boxer Rebellion. And when that happened in 1900, the Boxer Rebellion, a bunch of monkish-type dudes who had rallied some others to their cause said, we're going to take back our country with swords, and again, we're pure of mind and pure of Chinese spirit, so bullets won't hurt us. And so they went and took over the diplomatic quarters in the capital. I believe it was in Peking. So it would be the equivalent of taking over Washington, D.C. and holding all of the embassies hostage. So taking over the diplomatic side of D.C., where there's people from around the world there in their embassies, taking them all hostage and basically making demands that say, get all of your people out of our country or we're killing all these people. Did it work? I think you know the answer to this story, or the answer to that's a riddle before I even finished the story. And that is, of course it didn't. And in fact, it was a gigantic disaster. What it spurred was a response from the whole world at one time. All of the European powers and the United States and Russia and even Japan worked together. Maybe this is the only time in history this has happened. I've never looked deeply into that. But all of these entities worked together to defeat the Chinese government and to defeat this Boxer Rebellion movement. They sent forces in, all of these guys, the British, French, Portuguese, probably some Danes thrown in there for fun, Americans, Russians, and Japanese all sent in forces into the Chinese capital and wiped all these people out. It turned out that they couldn't repel bullets with pure thought. And so all the Boxers were wiped out. And then, even though it was not a government-sanctioned movement, the Boxers didn't care about the Chinese government either, but all the invading powers then set up shop and said, the government's going to pay for this, the government's going to pay for damages, and we're going to have a peace treaty. For us to even leave the capital of your country, you're going to sign away every single thing we want. And so the end result of the Boxer Rebellion was a much more dead Chinese people, morally decimated Chinese population, a government so ineffectual and corrupt and worthless that they signed away all trade rights to all foreign powers. So basically they signed a treaty that says, yep, anybody can do anything they want to in China and whatever. You guys don't want to pay taxes? Okay, don't pay tax. You want to take over all of our cities? Well, I guess take over all of our cities. We're powerless. That's how crucial the Boxer Rebellion was. In its absolute and abysmal failure, it was the last nail in the coffin of the Manchu dynasty and of China at the time. So that is how the 19th century ended for China. An abysmal failure, right in 1900, complete and utter wipeout of a movement and opening of the doors, and foreigners can do anything they want to. Could it be a worse century? The 19th century, utter destruction. Could it get worse? Yeah, it could. And that's where we're going to get to the 20th century in China in the next section of this lecture.